And let's begin with one of Alex's most common statements. Atheism is not a position. I'm not making any claims here. Now, if we look at the history of philosophy, this type of statement is a pretty recent development in the conversation. Atheism and agnosticism were understood to mean what common sense tells us that they mean. Atheism means, I believe God does not exist, and agnosticism says, I'm not sure whether God exists. In the philosophical community, atheist and theist alike were pretty well in agreement on this point. I've linked an article on atheism and agnosticism from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy if you want more details on this. But yes, it's not hard to work out that the etymology of atheism is atheism, technically denoting the mere absence of belief, but it's also not hard to work out that the purpose of language is a meeting of the minds and not just to win clever word games, so I'd like to think we could all just use our common sense here. And in fact, I always tell juries, you're allowed to use your common sense, but Alex wants us to define our terms and set parameters for the discussion, so let's do it. This recent aggressive shift to redefine atheism and weaken its claim from belief that God doesn't exist to a simple lack of belief can be traced to a few places. One major reason is Antony Flew, the Oxford philosophy professor and champion of atheism who wrote The Presumption of Atheism in 1976 and redefined atheism, and he was clear on why he wanted to do so. Here's a quote from that book. The debate about the existence of God should properly begin from the presumption of atheism, and the onus of proof must lie upon the theist. So he makes it clear, this is about shifting the burden of proof away from atheists and onto theists. As you can imagine, the atheists were quite upset when Antony flew right out of their camp and into theism. I guess his burden of proof was met, but he's not their only champion. We also have Carl Sagan, who popularized the sort of Humean assertion that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This is the so-called Sagan standard. Sagan being the atheist pop science writer who helped lead a big, expensive project to send messages into space just in case aliens might answer. Sagan is much like Richard Dawkins in that he does some good science, but when he leaves his area of expertise to dabble in philosophy, he starts sounding, sophomoric, which is why you won't hear any philosopher quoting Sagan on anything. That said, one atheist, other than Antony Flew, who does have some philosophical clout, is Bertrand Russell, and he frames his burden of proof argument around what is now called Russell's teapot, and it goes like this. If I assert without evidence that there's a teapot orbiting the sun, I have the burden of proving it. Otherwise, it's irrational for anyone to believe it. And I, like any thoughtful Christian, agree. It is irrational to believe assertions made without evidence. Even more philosophically impressive than Russell was his protege, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who many say was the greatest philosopher of the 20th century and who, to Russell's great chagrin, was nicknamed the man with the Gospels and dedicated his life's work to the glory of the Most High God. I don't believe Wittgenstein ever found evidence for his mentor's teapot, but it appears he did find evidence for God. But I digress. All these attempts by atheists to soften and redefine what it means to be an atheist have the same goal, shifting the burden of proof off of atheism and onto theism. The way they frame it, Christians posit the existence of God, which means they are making the affirmative claim and therefore have the burden of proof. Conversely, if atheists say they're not making any claims, then they can avoid any burden of proof, meaning they can hold their position without evidence, which is a nice advantage to have. Now, aside from being philosophically dubious and certainly not widely accepted, this whole burden of proof tactic is also misleading. Let's reduce the question of God's existence to its simplest form. Is the most basic, fundamental reality, the thing that simply exists because it exists, is that a mind or is it mindless? Now, we perceive lots of things around us, both mind and mindless, but it's apparently not obvious on the face of it which came first. And I say apparently because it seems obvious to me that whatever made these phenomena available to my senses and made my senses available to sense them, it wasn't mindless. But that's not a very useful argument. So the question at the most basic level is, did a mind first exist and make everything else? Or did something mindless first exist and organize itself mindlessly into everything we now see? Christianity has an answer to that question. When God speaks to Moses in Exodus, he gives himself this title, I am. So in Christianity, there's only one thing that simply is because it is, and that's God. The materialist answer to this question is that something mindless would have the right to say, I am, if it could speak. Only one of these options can be true. You can either pick one, or you can say, I don't know. But atheists frame it this way. They'll say, I'm not believing in anything, whereas you believe in God, so you have the burden of proof. Only then they'll go on to assume materialism across the board. So they're not really saying I don't know. They're trying to assert materialism but avoid having to support that assertion with any evidence. So I would think we're starting on even footing here because we're asking a question that goes to the fundamental, basic reality. And before evaluating the evidence, I'll be generous and say it's a true 50-50 coin toss between a mindful or mindless base level of reality, but it's far from obvious that it's mindless. There's something else we should keep in mind. The burden of proof doesn't affect the substance of the argument at all. It's purely a framing mechanism to help win a debate. It's tactical. In my field, the burden of proof is often the difference between winning or losing a case. The criminal burden of proof is beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a very high burden because of the very high stakes. The civil burden of proof, on the other hand, is preponderance of the evidence. More probable than not, 51% or more likely. Meaning, the exact same case with the exact same evidence could easily win under one burden and easily lose under the other. So even if I granted atheists that only I have the burden of proof, none of them have ever told me what that burden is. Is it logically airtight proof? Because if that's the case, I can't even prove to you that I exist. I can't prove anything to you. Is it beyond a reasonable doubt? Preponderance of the evidence? How do we decide which burden? And when does it cut both ways? In a legal case, you might not have the overall burden of proof, but still have the burden of proof on certain sub-questions within the overall case. So, are there any sub-questions atheists have the burden of proving, or do they insist that they never have to present evidence to support their claims? For instance, maybe I say, sure, I'll take Sagan's standard. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, I think materialism is an extraordinary assumption. Our observable universe mindlessly pops into existence and mindlessly organizes itself into everything we see and experience. That's quite an assumption, and if you want me to accept it, I personally would like to see some evidence. But again, this whole burden of proof framing is just a way to avoid facing just how extraordinary these atheist, and I really mean materialist, assumptions are. If I can hide behind never having to support my assumptions with evidence, that makes my job as an atheist really easy. It is interesting, though, because if they were confident that the evidence supported their views, they wouldn't need to hide behind these kinds of framing mechanisms to win the debate. They would just present their evidence. But since we're here talking about framing, I would like to offer a framing mechanism that I think is a lot more useful for this conversation. What if, instead of the burden of proof, we use the burden of trust? What are you building your life around and trusting that it will hold you up in the end? And this can be asked at a few levels. For instance, if you get in the car and drive to the store, you do so trusting on balance that you won't get hit and killed by another driver. You can't prove that you'll make it. You know there's a risk, but on the burden of trust, that risk seems small enough that it's worth it. The burden of trust asks, what do you trust with enough confidence that you'll risk something for it? What are you willing to bet your life, health, safety, or comfort on? Framed this way, I no longer care if the atheist is making an affirmative claim. That's not the most relevant question, because the fact remains that we all have to bet our lives on certain things. And in the case of atheism, they're betting on materialist assumptions. Public atheists in particular are not just betting on their own beliefs, they're betting on promoting a certain way of thinking that intentionally targets other people's beliefs, which in Alex's case means actively trying to obstruct belief in Jesus. So you've got to be trusting very strongly that Christianity is false, that everyone who's ever bought into it was wrong, and that the God of Abraham and Jesus is no risk to you. You're trusting this so strongly that you're willing to actively, publicly undermine the worldview. And I do have to admit, this has always been a bit strange to me. I often wonder why some atheists are so evangelistic about it. In fact, that's not even really the right way to say it, because the etymology of evangelism goes to the Greek euangelion, which means to spread good news, but materialism isn't good news. It's terrible news. Our life is a meaningless blip on the universal radar, except there is no radar, because no one will ever know or care what happened here. It will have been a brief and pointless taste of existence before we fall back into the void we briefly clawed our way out of. And none of the suffering, injustice, bloodshed, tragedy, or any other evil will ever be set right, because evil doesn't actually exist. It's all just brute facts. Life is nasty, brutish, and short, red in tooth and claw. So sort of like utopia and dystopia have their Greek words in good place and bad place, the opposite of euangelion, evangelism, spreaders of good news, would be disangelion, disangelism, spreaders of bad news. And why the urge to be a disangelist? What do you gain from it, even if what you're saying is true? You've supposedly discovered that life is pointless, but what's the point in advertising that? Obviously, I understand disangelism for practical reasons for Alex. It's how he makes his money, but I don't understand it for rational or moral reasons. And I'm not saying this in theory. Even when my agnosticism was at its strongest, I never dreamed of actively spreading my doubts to others. My existential crisis was uncomfortable enough, and I remained skeptical even within atheism, always asking, what if I'm wrong? Which Alex also claims to be doing. So the whole idea of having an atheist platform is strange to me, and I'm going to unpack just how strange it is for Alex in particular when we talk about morality in a moment, because I think for him, based on his ethical system, his entire platform is self-defeating. But for now, let's make one final point of clarification on the burden of trust. Keep in mind that when you're placing these kinds of bets, the amount of risk is evaluated on two fronts. One, how likely is it that the risk will occur? And two, how severe is the risk? So if I grab onto a rope and know it has a 50% chance of breaking, and if it breaks I will fall 3 inches to the floor, I might grab on and give it a try. However, if I know it has a 25% chance of breaking, but if it breaks I will fall 3 miles onto a concrete slab, I won't even think about it. But notice the risk likelihood was cut in half, whereas the risk severity was drastically increased. This illustrates the principle that as the severity of the risk increases, a rational person's tolerance for its likelihood will decrease. The person who grabs that rope over a 3-mile drop is not in their right mind. Here today, we're talking about atheism versus Christianity, which means the stakes are infinitely high, eternal. Now, some atheists might hear this and say, fine, I assert that you should worship the flying spaghetti monster and you'll go to hell if you don't believe me. Now what? And if someone asked me that, I would say, show me your evidence. Christianity isn't the only worldview presenting high stakes and serious consequences. I'm violating all sorts of Muslim, Jewish, and Hindu laws that would land me in some serious trouble if they're right. That's why I investigated all those religions and read their holy books along the way. So if you'd like to offer me a new worldview centered on unicorns or flying spaghetti monsters or Carl Sagan's aliens, then show me your evidence and I'll decide if it holds a candle to the evidence supporting Christianity. So to wrap up this section, you can try and frame the argument around burden of proof in order to evade evidence, but we all make decisions about how to live our lives under the burden of trust. Dangling over eternity, we grab onto some rope and hope it can hold our weight. We don't have a choice. We can try to shift the burden of proof, but no one avoids the burden of trust. And if the rope you're holding onto relies on materialist assumptions, you're out of your mind if you don't feel the need to seek out evidence to support those assumptions. That rope isn't nearly as strong as you may think.